along with Exiled Writers Inc., has organized this event, more or less single-handedly.
Thank you, James. Welcome, and thank you for coming to this symposium titled Arts in Dark Times, Endangered in Afghanistan, organised by Exiled Writers Inc. and the SOAS Centre for Cultural, Literary and Post-Colonial Studies. So this symposium will focus on the state of Afghan arts under the two Taliban regimes and the period in between. As you know, writers and other artists in Afghanistan are at risk facing danger under the renewed Taliban regime. But beyond broad representations presented by the media lie nuances and narratives of resistance that will be explored. The event aims not only to provide a platform for diverse voices and to increase knowledge and awareness, but also to generate activism. We really hope you'll contribute your thoughts and comments to make this event truly participatory and to discuss ways forward. Before I introduce the first session, moderated by Dr. Caron, I'll just tell you briefly about Exiled Writers Inc. So it brings together established and developing refugee and migrant writers to develop and promote their creative literary expression. It encourages cross-cultural dialogue and challenges abuses of human rights through writers and literary activism. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. James Caron, who will be moderating the first session, which is a roundtable discussion. James Caron is lecturer in Islamicate South Asia in the School of History, Religions and Philosophies at SOAS. He's a literary and cultural historian specializing in the history and sociology of knowledge in Pashto. He'll be joined by three writers, Suhrab Sirat, Abdul Sulamal, and Reza Mohammadi. And you will hear Suhrab and Reza reading their poetry later on. I believe that Reza will be joining the discussion group slightly late. So now I'll hand over to James for the first session. Thank you.
In this one, we're aiming at drawing out the history of literature in the public sphere across basically the first Taliban period, this Taliban period, and everything in between. And I'm really happy to be joined by, for now, 2 and eventually 3 long-term literary friends of SOAS. We've got Abdul Sulamal, who was born in Slovakia, born in Askamena, Nangarhar, after the fall of, sorry about that. He moved to Peshawar in the 90s and eventually to Slovakia. He's now been in London for a number of years. He's published 7 collections of short stories. They've been translated into English, Urdu, Dari, Hindi, and Slovak, published in the US, India, Slovakia, and Pakistan, both in standalone collections and in anthologies. He's also the head of the UK chapter of the Afghan Adabi Bahir, which began as a salon in Kabul and which we will talk a lot more about. So Sulamal, please come up and join us. In addition to Abdul Sulamal, we've got Suhrab Sirat, who is a poet, a writer, and a journalist at the BBC World Service. He was born in 1990 in Balkh. He came to the US as a UK as a political refugee in 2014. He's got 3 poetry collections published in Afghanistan and 1, The Eighth Crossing, in English in the UK, by our very own Exiled Writers Inc. So please, thank you. And finally, I gather that we'll be joined midway throughout by Reza Mohammadi from Kandahar, born in 1979. He studied Islamic law and philosophy, eventually earned an MA in globalization at London Metropolitan. He's got 3 collections of poetry as well. He's won awards for them, including Best Young Writer in Iran in the 1990s, and others from the Afghan Ministry for Information and Culture in the mid-2000s. And he's the current president of the Afghanistan Writers Union. He's got a translation with Nick Laird of his poetry in 2012, published here. All of our guests today are also cultural commentators, writers in various journalism outlets. Before I get started, I might like to ask everybody if you might please silence your phones, or even better, turn them off. You may not get reception down here anyway, but just to be on the safe side. Great. So I was going to start out with something, but Suhrab has informed me that he's prepared a bit of a presentation to sort of sum up the thing. After that, I'm going to ask both Suhrab and Sulamal to just describe their literary life as a way to draw out the history of literature in the public sphere over the periods in question. I always find that, having a concrete picture told from a first-person perspective is a good idea here. And at that point, we can work from there and have a sort of conversational session to end at around 3:20. Right, so... Yeah. Right, so just checking sound levels, everybody can hear us, no? Excellent. Okay, without further ado, please, Suhrab.
Yep, thank you, Dr. Caron. I would like to start by thanking Exiled Writers Inc. For organizing this great event at this very important time. I would like to talk about a few main aspects of Afghanistan's literature in the past 20 years, and before Afghanistan collapsed in the hands of the Taliban for the second time. After 9/11 and the international intervention in Afghanistan that resulted in the fall of Taliban's first regime in 2001, a new generation of poets and writers and artists started to rise from the ashes of a ruined country that had suffered 23 years of war at that time, 20 years ago. After this historical twist, the new generation had some freedom, some basic freedom and rights, like freedom to right to listen to the music, or watching a movie, or, for instance, reading the books they want to read. And there was a huge sense of hope, and there were lots of ambitious thoughts. I'm also part of that generation. We, the generation after 9/11, thought that now the war is over and we should now play our parts to build the country. As several groups of emerging poets and writers in different parts of Afghanistan started to create poetry, organize events, and also started to publish literary magazines and publish their collection of poetries and collection of their stories, novels. But soon after, just a few years after 2001, all those optimism slowly faded away. The Taliban started to reappear in the form of suicide bombers and insurgency. And for the young poets and writers like me, return of insurgency and war meant yet another era of struggle and campaign. But despite that, every week in several provinces of Afghanistan. There were dozens of literary events, book launches, concerts, and other cultural activities. So access to the internet, more scholarship opportunities, learning English language, and easier travel facilities gave the new generation an opportunity to become more aware of what's going on in the broader geography and what's going on in the world. So they got familiar with the world literature. They would talk about, for example, magic realism in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's books, or nihilism in Kafka's books, or let's say existentialism in Sartre, these kind of Eastern and Western thoughts and philosophies. But Afghanistan's literature has been completely transformed and entered a new era. A new generation of poets and writers came to existence that would not only they would write in the new forms, but they also transformed the existing classic forms into something completely different. They dared to break taboos and they had free access to literary events and classes. They were no longer, literature was no longer restricted to a very elite group, and there were lots of poets and writers who had a very poor background. I think the improvements and progresses of Afghanistan literature in the past 20 years, especially its poetry, was historically unprecedented, both in the number of poets and writers and also the quality of their works. In 10 to 15 years, Afghanistan has had hundreds of poets in all over the country. And once again, poetry became mainstream. Poetry used to be a mainstream centuries ago, but it was restricted in the king's darbars. We had, for example, Ghaznavid's era, that there were hundreds of poets there, but it was only restricted to the darbars of kings. One of the most remarkable facts about the past 2 decades in Afghanistan is the emergence of female poets and writers. A large number of young women and girls joined the new saga. Afghanistan had never seen such a large number of female poets. In fact, let's say 60 years ago, we had no female poets in Afghanistan, or we had few who never expressed themselves publicly. But now every city has had at least 10 female poets who would openly express themselves, their feelings, their feminine feelings and emotions in their poetry. Even some of them risk to write explicit erotic poems. As I'm speaking now, after the collapse of Afghanistan to the Taliban in August, dozens of both female and male poets and writers fled the country. Many of the writers are on their way to get to a safe place, and many are living in fear and looking for a way out. And was just a brief introduction of what happened in the past 20 years in Afghanistan's literature.
Thanks. Das the presentation. Okay, thank you, Suhrab. And let's turn it over to Abdul Sulamal.
Hello everyone.
We can't hear.
Again, Hello everyone. First of all, I would like to repeat to let me thank organizer of this very important and very important day, this symposium. Said the end of Taliban rule and the establishment, you hear me?
Yes.
Of Republic marked the beginning of a thriving journey for Afghan art and literature. The first one, the sanction of music, cinema and theater were lifted, and the plans to flourish these elements of the country's art were designed and implemented. A brief summary of the development in foremost area of the Afghan art is provided as below. First, music. As Suhrab said, the singers were able to attend parties after a long stretch break, and their sweet numbers dominated the airways. Concerts were held all across the country. Many popular singers like Ahmad Nasir Sarmas, Farhad Darya, Wahid Qasimi, Ayana Said, Angama, and others returned home. Some on extensive and successive trips and fought forward their systematic effort to flourish the country's music. Mr. Sarmas founded Afghanistan National Institute for Music, also known as ANIM, where numerous musicians and instrumentalists were trained. One of the greatest achievements of the institute was the creation of a national ensemble. We didn't only perform with the country, but traveled across the globe, including in Europe, Asia, and America. Besides attracting a huge audience with the country, Afghan singers were able to perform in international concerts. Vocalists such as Salim Sarmas and Ariana Said were able to win prestigious international awards. Recently, a special department of musical study opened in Kabul University. School department of musical studies opened in Kabul, and many private music educational centers spring up all around. Every TV channel in the country had a sizable share of music broadcasts. Some TV channels launched national competition to discover and train new musical talent. Afghan Star, organized annually by Tuluni, is a good example. Cinema. Cinema too flourished the past 20 years of the Republic. A number of our private cinematic centers joined the state-run institution of Afghan film in the race. producing dozens of short and long movies. Some of these movies eventually made their way to the international festival and awards. Osama, for instance, a movie directed by Siddiq Bamar, won the Gold Club Award. And well-known Afghan directors were chosen as members of the jury at international festivals. The movies producing in Afghanistan opened their path to the international market and festivals. And Kabul and other big and historical cities such as Herat and Bamyan hosted a number of international festivals. One of the examples could be the Herat International Film Festival, funded by Ruya Film House and Armanshir in 2013. Lately, not only has the number of film festivals on national level increased, many such festivals have been held abroad, funded by the Afghan Ministry of Information and Culture and the Foreign Culture entitled, such as the American Culture Center, French Culture Center, Goethe Institute, and so on, so forth. The share of the Afghan female directors in the cinematic products increased during the final years of the Republic. Now Sara Karimi and Roya Sadat are not frontrunners in Afghan cinema only. They are the well-known directors and film producers on the international stage. Theater. Theater, unfortunately, the theater didn't receive the attention it deserved during the Republic and didn't flourish the way it did in the 19 and 1917s. Neither the stage in Kabul was revived the way it should have. No national and international plays were organized. However, many of Afghan theater festivals were held annually. Afghan renowned actors and actresses played a constructive role in national plays. And some of them, like Mamnoon Maksudi, appeared in a number of acclaimed plays outside Afghanistan. Maksudi and other players, for instance, performed the comedy of Errors by William Shakespeare. Literature. In the Mujahideen and Taliban stamped out the literature. It ran its life soon after the Republic was brought to power in the country. Many state and private culture institutions were founded, resumed. Several international culture organizations such as the French Culture Center, Goethe Institute, and British Council opened their offices in Kabul and other provinces and funded numerous literary festivals, seminars, and workshops, and translated and published dozens of Pashto and Dari books during these years. Hundreds of private printing houses and publishers started operating, such as Aksuz, Surush, Danesh, Mohammad, Amiri, Shariati, and Maksudi, and published hundreds of books each on a monthly basis. The books published in the past 20 years outweigh the books published in years of all former governments combined. Unsurprisingly, the number of female writers increased too, and words of some of them were translated into foreign language. Dancing in the mosque, an Afghan mother's letter to her son, authored by Humaira Qadri, can be a great example in this regard. Hila Pasarli, Safia Wardak, and Zala are the Pashto creative writers whose works are good enough to be translated into other languages. Now Pashto female writers truly equal their male counterparts. Another achievement was the translation of dozens of world masterpieces into Dari and Pashto. Many great Russian classical novels were, for instance, translated by Latif Bahan, including those of Lev Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Chekhov. Dr. Isa translating Sinoha and Hayat Jwandun translated Albert Camus' Misunderstood Play and Stranger novel, demonstrated that Pashto has gotten the translators it required for masterpiece. In the area of Republic, writers were independent and their works were not censored at all. Finally, let me say that Pashto writers tried all the international contemporary creative forms in real time over the past 20 years, and it was something that happened for the first time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Suhrab and Sulamal. I think we want to open it up to questions and answers. Before doing that, I kind of wanted to send it out in a direction that selfishly I'm interested in. It's very tempting to, well, a couple of points. First of all, it's very tempting to point out that various NATO and other developmental funds put in about $60 million over the course of this entire period to increasing an already sort of eager and vibrant media infrastructure. And a lot of what I would like to call attention to is all of that eagerness and vibrancy that was always there. So like even during first Taliban, there were organizations like Afghan Adabi Bahir, which existed in these spaces between Kabul and the other cities and places abroad like Peshawar or Iran, which my colleague Susanna Olszewska has worked quite a bit on. So I'd like to talk about actually, if either of you would be interested in saying, like, how has your own literary practice changed as a result of this rise in infrastructure, but where was it sitting before, if relevant? In other words, like before 2001, Sulamal said, you yourself worked in literary circles between Afghanistan and Slovakia and London and Peshawar and for many years. So how did this change for you personally? And Suhrab, this is also something. How have you seen it change over the number of years since 2001? But also, like, what were people already doing before? And more importantly, what can we expect now based on your experience? These are kind of questions that I'm interested in. I think Jennifer had it.
Yeah. So this panel focuses on the extent of the flourishing of the arts in Afghanistan during the 20 years when foreign troops were present. And I wondered whether there were any areas in the literary sense that you felt did not develop as you would have liked, were perhaps adversely influenced by, I don't know, Western influences, I don't know, I'm just curious to know whether that was a possibility or not. And then also the second question is whether writers, those in the literary field, were influenced by the presence of Western troops, whether that kind of made you curious about more, made you want to know more about Western literature, about all the different facets and the latest movements. So kind of, were there any negative aspects about the 20 years in terms of literary development, and was the literary sector influenced by the presence of Westerners?
Well, when the first regime of the Taliban ended, I was only 12, maybe 11, and I started writing poetry in 2010, I would say, 2010. But I think because English language became an important language in Afghanistan after the Western troops came to Afghanistan, because knowing English meant that you could have more opportunities to work for several NGOs and foreign offices, and you have a higher salary. That also, I think, resulted in to get more familiar with the Western culture. We had uncensored, unfiltered internet. We could chat and find a broader network beyond Afghanistan, especially Persian writers in Afghanistan could establish a great network with Iranian poets and writers, and they could use their experience, because when we were busy in our civil war and everything, Iranians translated many of the Western literature into Farsi, and that was kind of ready meal, something that was ready for the Persian speakers in Afghanistan that could use it, even for Pashto speakers who could translate it into Pashto from Farsi. But I think the important thing was that there was no inspection, and no one would tell you that don't write this and that. But at the same time, it shows that I sometimes wonder that is my work, is it worth it that the people don't really inspect it? Do they care what we write or not? Because there was no system of supporting poets and writers, and therefore there was no one to tell you not to write this and that. Everyone was busy with their politics and their own kind of agendas, making money and using the opportunities to somehow benefit themselves. But one thing that affected positively in Afghanistan literature was this open space. You could read anything you want, you could watch anything you want to watch, but there was no systematic there was no system to censor you, which meant that if there was a system, then you would expect the government to support you, to give you some funding to publish your books. But if there's no one to tell you not to write this, it means that your writing is your writing valued by the system or not? But the negative aspects, I think, there was some groups or some of the people who felt the danger of being criticized in the form of poetry, because poetry is such a a big thing in Afghanistan. This is a big culture. If you would, let's say, in satire form, if you criticize the government or certain people, they could easily target you. They could easily make trouble for you. So there was no system of supporting the writers as well. I don't know if Sulamal said us some more.
For me, a little bit, it is a very good question, but explained by myself in my full English for me was difficult. But
Okay,
when I can't, I will.
some of the.
I wasn't in period of Taliban in Afghanistan. I was in Pakistan, and after in Europe, immigrate. But, yeah. In the regime of Taliban, as in generally everything was tough. The literature as well. It is just somewhere as James says, just poetry somewhere organized, and that is all as I know my information. Regarding your question, what was negative in the literature in Afghanistan in the period of the Republic?
There were a few things that were negative. Right, censorship certainly ended.
بل نه پوهېږم بیا زه د خبره صحیح پوه نه شوم بیا څه رقم و خو ډېره بېحده ازادي وه یعنې هر څه ته ویلی شو چې په شعر کې په داستان کې منعکس کړي او د هر چا په وړاندې ووایي یعنې ممانعت نه و دې باندې څوک نه دي هغه شوي ده
Right, so there was really no limit on
تعدیل شوي
Right, so there was really no limit on saying whatever you wanted to say to whoever you wanted to say it to.
او چې شی چې ډېر نیګټیو و هغه دا و چې د خپله د دولت د حکومت خپله اسپیشلی د اطلاعاتو فرهنګ وزارت د ادبیاتو په پرمختګ کې یعنې همې بودیجه کمه وه همې توجه کمه وه
Right, so it's
خاص کوم ځانګړی پروګرام چې په پخوا دغه هغه کې نه و
So it's much like Suhrab was saying. I mean, the state really didn't put much investment into anything. They really didn't, they really didn't care. This is including the Ministry for Information and Culture.
Oh.
Pakwa dase no kana like pakwa.
اوس راځم پخوا ته ډېر مهم شی چې دی چې د لیکوال د لیټریچر لپاره چې ډېر مهم دی د لیکوال لپاره لیکوال د خپل خلاقیت کریشن مزد نه اخیسته اقوزامه ورته وایي پیسې ورته وایي دغه
Right, so in order to realize their creativity, I mean, writers really do need material, they have material needs as well, like money and other modes of support.
زمونږ د ادبیاتو د سپورټ سیستم د شاهي دولت و که بیا وروسته جمهوریت شو د داود خان یا د حزب دیموکراتیک په ټوله دوره کې یو سیستم و چې لیکوال شاعر د خپل شعر د خپل داستان د خپل ناول د خپل تحقیق اقوزامه یې اخیسته دا ډېره مهمه
Right, so, I mean, during the monarchy period, during the Daud's Republic, during the communist period, like during all of these times, there were modes of patronizing, like state modes of patronage to authors.
کتابونه یې چاپېدل
Right, books were printed.
منتها محدودو د وخت حکومت د کمیسیون نه تېرېده چې په دې حکومت په دې رژیم کې نه وو په دغه شلو کلونو د جمهوریت په وروستیو کلونو کې دا شوي.
Right, and because the state was involved, then they also sort of limited what you could say and do.
بل د حزب دیموکراتیک په وخت کې یو شی چې ښه و د هنر ټولو برخو هغه که د هنرمندانو که لیکوالو دوی خپل اتحادیې لرلې.
So one thing that was nice during the communist time is that they formed unions of artists in all different fields. Whether you're talking about musicians or writers or whatever. And this is important because in Afghanistan, poetry has never been strictly a written activity. And so you need the musicians as part of the literary formation. You need the live events and all of this too.
او دوی دغه اتحادیو دغه مختلفې برخې مدیریت کولې او دولت سپورټولې.
Right, and these unions were supported by the state.
Can I just, I'd just like to say, you probably noticed the presence of 2 male writers, and I think a third has just arrived. We did attempt to invite a really good woman poet who has just been published by Caron, the prestigious poetry publisher, but she was unavailable. So perhaps the presence of 3 male writers reflects the tradition of Afghanistan, but although you, Suhrab, mentioned that women suddenly emerged and started writing and even started writing erotic poetry, but in exile in London there don't seem to be many women writers. There were 2 I contacted, but neither were available. So just to inform you of that.
No, what's the negative shan should be the najdi waqt ki tiri waqt ki the sangu like that's what like dumra azad what like its structure no or balada it's Sahara no like in terms of
اوس وخت کې د قانون د مخې قانون ډېر شیان منې کړي وو مونږ their control no.
Okay, right. So I was bringing the conversation back to what were the negative things during the last 20 years, and it's like, yeah, there was absolutely no control over anything, and there was no support. But continue.
Was the Khalid Husseini kitab the Caron Afghanistan ki mane ho magar chap sho kharse the khalq war khiste yad atiq rahimi sangi sagur.
Right.
The menu. Ama khalq wa khiste chap edanam akhistanam chat so tsanedi bile.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, you could write anything and pardon? Right. And so giving the examples of like Kite Runner and Atiq Rahimi's novels as well. Yeah, any more questions? I saw one right in the middle. And then so okay, let's take 3 at a time. I don't think we can keep more than that.
We need a roving microphone.
This place has got good acoustics. If you can speak up, please. Yeah, we can take a question in Pashto. Okay, Mr. Bahir works for BBC. Yep. Okay, so we did in fact have loads of books published. Right, so...
What was the question?
Yeah. It was not really a question as such. In the future, can we ask that people phrase things in terms of questions for, especially targeted at our panelists' knowledge and experience? Okay, yes, sir. I think you have one.
You very eloquently portrayed the flourishing of Afghan literature in these 20 years after the first Taliban rule. But I would like to ask you, what happened to the reading public in these 20 years? Did the reading public or listening public expand as well? Was it only limited to the cities? Or did you reach the countryside? Did you reach those people in those areas where the Taliban are actually rooted? Did you go beyond the boundary to the other side, so to say, in your writings?
Actually, it was really good in that aspect because everyone had this a platform on social media. For instance, they could write a poem and publish on social media, and everyone would read it. But in terms of presence of the audience, I remember when I published my first collection of poetry and when I was 19, it was published by a local association of writers, and 3 months after it was published, it was sold out. So it meant that there was a thirst in the poetry, and especially the new form of poetry in Afghanistan. In the past 20 years, the audience expanded. For example, Mohammadi's poems were read in Iran, and also he was translated in English, and he was known even in England as well. So I think the common language between Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Iran, one of the languages, Farsi or Dari, it meant that these three countries had more links, more networks. They expanded their links. There were events that the poets would travel to Iran or Tajikistan, and the poets from Iran and Tajikistan would travel to Afghanistan. And also, Pashto speakers in Pakistan would understand the poem written in Pashto in Afghanistan. And like this, even Uzbeki. So there are, in the region, we have these common languages, and freedom of expression and also access to the internet meant that there were lots of opportunities to expand your network and expand your audience. And that's it.
I mean, I just give an example. Like, so I used to go to this literary salon in Kabul, the Afghan Adabi here. And the thing was really interesting because it shows like it's not just readership. I mean, you have to kind of think of the audience in much broader terms. And so they would do these live events. The live events would be live streamed. They would go on the radio. They'd go on the internet. During the radio ones, you could have people calling in long distance, you know, and they had, and that actually freed up some people. You know, you would have people calling from, like, you'd have young women calling from rural Kandahar who were listening to this thing. And I mean, so when you kind of look at the participatory elements of literary exchange, then actually, you know, it was remarkably sort of deep and broad. And all of these same people who were at the event in Kabul, you know, also have their books published in Kabul and in Pashto and Peshawar, like simultaneously, much in the way that Suhrab is saying. You know, these things had simultaneously a grassroots participation and a sort of large-scale published presence globally. Right, who do we have? I think we only really have time for one more question, unfortunately. At that point, we've got to move on to a reading of poetry by Reza Mohammadi and Suhrab Sirat, I believe. But so, yes, please.
Just a very quick one to follow up your point. In these how did women participate in the events that you were referring to, and to what extent? Because I think what appears to me, and quite strongly, is that art and poetry has definitely developed in the past 20 years, but I really am not convinced how it touched women.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Reza can answer it. He was the head of the union, so
I didn't understand, sorry, you can repeat it. How development of, what's it again?
خب این خواستم ببینم خب آره خیلی از این برنامه ها بوده گویا توی کافه ها توی کابل غیر و ذالک و در ضمن توی عرض 20 سال اخیر طبیعتاً هنر و شعر در افغانستان خیلی خوب پیشرفت کرده ولی میخواستم بدونم زنان چطور توی این برنامه ها شرکت میکردن و تو چه حد این هنر و شعر به کمک زنان در افغانستان اومده.
It's a bit difficult to answer that actually. There have been actually in Afghanistan two different societies. Everybody says that the division between ethnic societies, Pashtun, Hazaras, and Tajiks and I have to say that there are two societies in Afghanistan: modern society and fundamental society. In modern society, which was growing every day actually in the last 20 years, and unfortunately the international community betrayed them and left them behind in Afghanistan in a serious danger. There were, and still there are many women actually who are writing. I mentioned the Tishanwari a couple of weeks ago about a young lady poet in Kandahar who is writing modern poems, really modern poems, and she's only 20 years old. And another one actually I know in Logar actually, it's another Pashtun speaker's poems. Another lady who's only 19 years old, and she's also writing actually, I can say actually, modern poems. But the point is, in these two societies, which one of them was close to Taliban and fundamental people in Afghanistan, they had enough support. Last year, a book published in the United States is called Poetry of Taliban, which says how Taliban used poetry in their fight against the international community. And they won, but he claims in his book that the Taliban won the war with poetry. But in other side, where the modern society is, as you see now, there is no support. Nobody actually, it's a little bit political if I say. There was a kind of financial corruption between Afghanistan government and the international community. And unfortunately, or fortunately, poets and writers haven't been involved in this corruption. They didn't go to Western embassies to ask them for funds or projects or any kind of famous corruption which goes in Afghanistan. But because of this, at the moment, their life is not important for international community, for Western countries actually, who used to be in Afghanistan for 20 years and now actually left all the people, especially civic society, and especially writers and poets who were the only actually the real fighters for civic society and for human rights values and humanity values or anything actually that we know. Yes, it was a small society, was growing in the last 20 years, but now we can see it stopped, maybe. And maybe it can be, I don't know, maybe most of them could be killed actually in near future or in coming days or weeks, because actually they were in other sides of society who were fighting the Taliban. Yes, there are no problem with poets and writers who were with Taliban in the last 20 years, but with women and men, writers and poets actually who were in modern society, who were supporting Western values, I can say actually there is a real big danger at the moment.
Okay. I'm afraid to all of you who have got questions, this is, we're already over our time a bit. Jennifer, would you like to introduce?
Thank you very much to Dr. James Caron, Suhrab, Reza and Abdul, who were talking about the extent of the flourishing of the arts in Afghanistan during the 20 years, but invariably the effect of the previous Taliban regime crept into that discourse.